Great to see everybody. Good morning. This is a completely different session than the sessions which have been, all the sessions which happened yesterday. Some of them were on governance, some were M&A, some were privacy. But currently, the buzzword which is everywhere is generative AI, Metaverse, Web 3.0, and a lot of related technologies, right? And let me spend 30 seconds on the topic, and then, of course, I'll hand it over to our esteemed panelists. Generative AI, in simple words, where the machine has got more and more intelligent is what, right? Today, you are feeding in words in a machine. You want an essay on the law of damages, you get an essay. Before Google, you would say law of damages, you would get searches. So when the machine is generating content for you in a structured manner, which is extremely human-alike, is generative AI. And this can be in the form of words, this can be in the form of images, it can be in the form of graphical arts, there can be a fusion of it, and of course, the other angle of all of this is the metaverse, which is also a digital twin of the real, and we don't know where's the real and real. And with this backdrop, we would open the session. Let me, start on my right, and Harry can quickly introduce himself, and then Vivan and Jyoti, and then we'll just roll on.
Great, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the ABA for having me. It's a real honour to be here and to speak. And this is a very exciting topic, so I'm very excited to be here. So my name's Harry Evans. I'm a partner in the corporate team of Herbert Smith Freehills, based in Singapore. Even though I sit in corporate, I'm not actually an M&A lawyer. I started my career as an IP litigator and did a lot of work for the tech, pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors in relation to the enforcement and protection of their IP rights. And then over a few years, I sort of transitioned to the non-contentious side of things, where now I advise on IP commercialization, data rights, tech commercialization and the like. I work with a lot of tech companies, digital banks, fintechs, health techs, and I think the sort of common theme is that all of these businesses are starting to integrate more innovative technology solutions into their business. And so really look forward to talking about some of the issues that they're grappling with. Back to you.
Thank you. And I'll go on to my left. Vivan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Vivan Sharan. I am a partner at Coan Advisory. And I'm perhaps the only non-lawyer among all of you. Our firm focuses on intersectional issues related to technology. So we have a multidisciplinary and a multidimensional approach. And I think that's probably the need of the hour. And we'll discuss how different domains really spill over into technology and emerging technology, even as we think about foundational questions around the design of governance and first principles and so on and so forth. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good morning. And thanks to ABA for giving me this opportunity to be here. Well, I am Jyoti. I am the General Counsel of Aditya Birla Fashion and Retail Limited. It's India's leading fashion conglomerate, known for its brands, Louis Philippe, Van Heusen, Ellen Solly. Of course, you would know these also, pantaloons, luxury brands like Sabyasachi, Shantanu Nikhil, Masaba. Of course, we have our own international brand acquisitions for India, which are like American Eagle, Polo Ralph Lauren, and many others. So my role, of course, as a general counsel, of course, I had a team of 32 lawyers, and I advise ABFRL and its subsidiaries on a gamut of topics like IPR, technology, privacy, and of course, the contracting, brand licensing, compliance, real estate, and whatever comes our way, because we are into, many brands and many, products, basically lifestyle products. Yeah, that's in short about me.
I think, we couldn't have wished for a better panel. So we have somebody from the industry who's going to give industry insights, which is Jyoti. We have Vivan, who's going to give a color of policy and inputs on the same, and Harry is going to give us a cross-border perspective. So I think it's a perfect blend. So I think let us start with industry first, Jyoti, because industry is always paramount. How do you see these newer age, technologies enhancing your business and kind of changing the overall industry? Your take basis, you've been in this industry for so long. Any thoughts would be great.
Yeah, hi. Well, before I answer your question, Huzefa, I think it's important to kind of demystify certain terms which are often used, which is like everyone, when you talk about, technology, and you all think about, digitization, which is basically converting the documents from manual form to digital form. Well, I don't think that's an issue today because this has been happening for so long. Then what is the next? There's a digitalization, which is actually the workflows. The workflows, basically, if you are approving a certain thing, or if you are kind of building a project, designing a product, things like that. This is a digitalization. Basically, every process which was earlier manual is now getting into the process is becoming digitized. There's digitalization. The newer word that you hear these days is digital transformation. Digital transformation is not the same as digitalization. That's one thing that we need to keep in mind. Digital transformation, we are talking about those digital technologies where, the physical and the virtual world, the difference between the two is getting blurred. Basically, it's like a fusion of both, right? So if I were to explain again in terms of, I think it's a little technical, but it's important to understand these jargons. If you look at the Web 1, like which the internet when it started in 90s, and up to all the 2004s and all, which was a Web 1 technologies, which was what? It's a static websites. You just go to the website, you access the information, and that's about it. It's just one way. Then came Web 2, which is like, so we used to write the read only, that is Web 1. Then comes Web 2, which is like read and write, basically where the customer starts writing your their comments, and then you use their comments, you assess their comments, and then you give services, or probably you improve your services. So it's basically read and write. That is Web 2, which you are still into. But what's coming up is Web 3, which is read, write, and own. So which is like, the users are just not posting, but they're also owning their content. So you're talking about a very different technology, and so that's why digital technologies have to be understood very differently. And now when it comes to our businesses, of course, we are just not the only business we have impacted by it. Okay, if the finance, of course, fashion, entertainment, all of them are going through this, right? So answering your question, Zephyr, where do I see myself, with all these technologies coming in? Retail, whether it's retail, fashion, all of these consumer-facing industries are going to be transformed big way. Why? Because of the involvement of the consumers itself. So if you look at, of course, the Metaverse, I'm sure all of you have heard of Metaverse. Metaverse is basically a virtual world. It's an immersive experience where you create your own digital avatars. Of course, you can, very recently we had our venues and digital concert. So you could just choose your hairstyle, you could choose your dresses, you could dress up for the party even before the party starts. And then you visualize yourself participating in it, right? So Metaverse is going to be a game changer totally. Why? Because what was not possible is going to be possible. Something like today, if I were to sell just the NFTs, NFT was a big boom just about 2 years back, but then it kind of slided and then it is still recovering. See, when we also experimented with NFTs. So what are NFTs basically? They are basically digital files, of course. We are using blockchain technologies in a decentralized world. You are selling those digital files through the marketplace, which is a blockchain, driven marketplace. So what was happening? You sell it to them, and then of course it's not selling. Basically, it's a licensing of IPR that happens there. So it goes from one person to another. but the guy who owns it continues to get, revenue out of it. But the same NFT things are now being brought back in NFTs, in a metaverse also. So if you look at it that way, it's going to change, everything big way, because you are creating your own digital stores. You said, like, how is it practical? So we are just not going to have a retail, brick and mortar stores. We're going to have digital stores as well. So people just don't want to buy real products. They also want to buy, digital goods for the digital avatars. You can dress up your avatar the way you want, right? So you would like to buy the shoes and the jackets and whatever it is, and then you would like to see how your avatar looks like. So that is one space which is going to, again, get you revenues. So that is, again, it's going to be a game changer. And of course, we used to have a lot of like these concerts and all of that, but just imagine getting Justin Bieber all the time, all the way from the US. I don't know if you have to book him, probably you have to book him like 2 years in advance. You may not get his appointment. But then today, you know that Justin Bieber also went into Metaverse in 2021. And then, if you have a Metaverse, Justin Bieber's avatar in Metaverse, and then you can actually create, you co-brand, and then you can do a lot of things, which otherwise would not have been possible. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say, that a lot of these things, like whether it is concerts, whether it is owning a space in Metaverse, running a store, selling digital products, all of these things are going to change the way our industry is going to function. And of course, it's already showing. That it's happening, as I told you, as I gave you many examples, but we can discuss more as we go along.
No, thank you so much. I think this, the context setting sets the tone, bang on. And of course, there are a lot of IP, legal, regulatory issues on what you just said. But I think the key takeaway is at a organizational level, when consumerism is evolving and more and more people are looking out for a certain way of digital transformation, what Jyoti said is so correct. At an organizational level, being receptive to those trends is also extremely, extremely pertinent. I think on that note, let us shift gears. And, Vivan, it would be great considering, your on-ground expertise and interactions with the government. How do you see overall policy and governance impacting, the business landscape in relation to these technologies?
Thank you. Okay, so I think there are two levels at which we need to think and unbundle this question. The first is in relation to what Jyoti just mentioned in terms of what is happening currently and what we can expect to see in the next year or two. Let's call it the vanilla level of integration of machine learning more than artificial intelligence into business decisions, as well as consumer servicing. And then let's segregate that from slightly more cerebral areas, which are uncharted as yet in terms of how technologies like ChatGPT will transcend their narrow utilitarian function of providing you with intelligent chatbots and actually impact business landscapes in a more fundamental way. And obviously, these will be concerns or the preserve of governments and authorities the world over when that happens. So on the vanilla question of how technologies are integrating, these kind of technologies are already integrating into businesses. In the retail context, for instance, there are 2 or 3 types of algorithmic engines that run. Recommendation engines are perhaps the most prominent. So you go to an e-commerce website and it recommends something to you. And similarly, if you're consuming media on Netflix, Disney, Amazon, there are also preference and matching engines that will look at your sort of consumption profile, match you with content that the engine thinks you may like. These are fairly simple input-output sort of engines where it may be possible, and it is kind of possible, to standardize the way that that engine works. So you have a black box, you have an input, and for a given set of similar inputs, you'll probably have the same output. And therefore, it becomes possible to circumscribe that black box and say, okay, I don't want these XYZ kind of biases to impact lives, livelihoods, consumer experiences, etc. And this is a direction in which we are already traveling. So the Telecom Engineering Center, for those of you who are interested, released a sort of draft standards framework on these kind of vanilla preference matching engines and so on and so forth. And that's under consultation, so put your feedback through to the TEC if you're so interested. Then there is also the question of how the seemingly vanilla impacts us in slightly more profound ways than throwing up media suggestions that we may or may not like. And by the way, on that count, I think we sometimes tend to over-index on things like algorithmic accountability in the normal retail consumer environment, just because it's it's got a certain hype and a certain buzz around it. But if you go to like a retail store, a physical brick and mortar store, nobody's telling that store how to arrange items for consumers to see and so on and so forth. No one is telling you how to, manage your shelf space. These are intrinsically B2B decisions or, innate to a business itself. So when you're not thinking about recommendations in a departmental store, you don't need to necessarily think about it in the media context unless there are only two places where you consume your media, and therefore it has a massive impact on society and so on and so forth. But coming back to the other subset of this vanilla case, there are instances where matching engines, for instance, could have more profound effects and therefore can be considered to be higher risk. So for instance, many of you may not know it, but you probably all have been subject to some form of, at least the younger lot here, some form of a matching engine which has rated for instance, your resumes, as part of like what companies are building into very simple HR tech, and matching it against the JDs that employers or prospective employers may be putting out. And if there are biases of selection of a particular type of resume with certain credentials, it can lead to exclusion risks that are fairly obvious. So I'm not saying that these current set of technologies are not risky. There are those that are higher risk, and I think some of them we're not even sort of aware of. And those are not necessarily in the retail context. But then when we look at slightly, like I said, more cerebral aspects of AI and machine learning, then and if we take the example of ChatGPT, for instance, which is generative AI, generates text-based, human-like text based on prompts, trains on large data sets to do so, uses certain large language models and so on and so forth, and a lot of math. Now, one of the interesting things about this form of artificial intelligence is that even the creators of these massive engines may not be able to give you the theory behind why a certain answer or how a machine has answered your question. So why a certain answer has come versus another, because there is a self-learning process that happens as the computation happens. So there's this computational irreducibility in a sense. So let me put it another way. If any of you had the misfortune of doing maths like I did at a higher level than in school, you would have had to deal with theorems and proofs. And essentially what these theorems and proofs are theoretical ways of capturing, in a way, nature. A lot of it stems from astronomy, for those of you who who like economic history. A lot of it is linked to the history of math. A lot of it was linked initially to the movement of stars and so on and so forth. And it's possible for us to predict movement of planets and so on and so forth because there are theories that we have made based on empirical data, similar to how you would expect a machine to give you answers to basic math questions and problems. So you can have a very well specified function through which you put that data. It's like the vanilla black box that I mentioned earlier in the case of preference engines and so on. You have a very standardized output when you have a theoretical way of being able to instruct the machine to do something, including simple math. But this is not the case with generative AI as it stands today. There is no way to reduce the answer to your question to a theoretical framework that then can be governed. And this then begets the question of how policymakers, think tankers, civil society, etc., can weigh into this question of bias or any other ethical concerns that one may have with generative AI. So, and it's a very difficult question. And there are two schools of thought on this. One actually stems from even people like the Chief Technology Officer of OpenAI, which, as you know, is the organization behind ChatGPT. She says that it's not too early to start thinking about these questions, and we must think about these questions. By the way, this is a stark departure from how some of our other technology companies have talked about regulation. The move fast, break things ethos exemplifies that. Where technology companies say, don't stymie innovation, let things develop, and when there's a market failure, figure out how you can contain it, and then build principles on the basis of that. But the Chief Technology Officer of OpenAI argues to the contrary, without necessarily having the answer to the question that came before this, which is, how do you actually get down to doing it when you can't reduce your model to a theoretical framework that is very definite? And we can unpack elements of this. I know it sounds a little confusing, but simply put, there's so much math that goes in the background of any answer that you see on ChatGPT or equivalent large language models, that it's very hard to work backwards to definite points in time and space and try to map a theory around it. And I think we're all going to grapple with it in the days ahead. Questions linked to the metaverse are perhaps a little simpler, less complex, but again, the metaverse intersects with artificial intelligence inexorably, and so you'll it'll be very difficult to be deterministic about how we go from here in terms of regulating the metaverse. There are questions around how existing ways in which we frame questions around data protection will apply to the metaverse. I mean, you guys know that we've been very consent-centric in how we think about privacy, and that's a sort of legacy from, medicine and pharmaceutical industries, and how that evolved in the US. But maybe it's not purpose fit for a metaverse sort of a situation where if you're in an Aditya Birla store, I don't think Jyoti will have the opportunity of asking you for consent every time you see something on a shelf, and it may be sort of not for children, or it may not be appropriate for others, or whatever. Just imagine the level of friction you'd have if you're ticking a box every time that happens. So there'll be therefore this contrary tendency of companies to try to get you to tick as many boxes as soon as you enter the metaverse. And that is obviously, again, antithetical to the notion of purpose limitation. So how do we think about purpose limitation, and how do we think about consent in the metaverse? Complex question, no ready answers, but you have to move beyond what we know already. Similarly, on security, a lot of questions to unpack in terms of complexity of those questions. So we'll, I'm sure, get to those. I don't want to monopolize the flow.
No, but I think it is so well put, right? At a very core level, the two examples, Jyoti and Vivan both have given, taking these two technologies, for example, they are right here, but they too are different, but still they kind of overlap. And I'll give a simple example, right? Taking the metaverse, for example, beyond the legal concerns, if you go beyond, and we will discuss those legal concerns, there is a predictability of output. That's how I would see it. Somewhere it is structured and there is a certain predictability of output. But if you look at the other technology, which is right here, which is existing, which is generative AI, as Vivan and Jyoti explained, ChatGPT or DALI, which, it is like if you type a line saying that, please give me an image of a sunset with a boy, with a ball in his hand. The images could be 5 times, which would differ each time when you put in that prompt. So the interesting part here, and then of course we will not keep the lawyers away because there is always legal broad brush to all of this. But what I want to say is that at the same time we have such unique technologies, and at a core level one, you can say that the output, there is some amount of predictability with a certain structure. But for the other one, it can go into multiple directions, which we will discuss. I think on that note, Harry, let me come to you. And the lawyers always have the last word. So, basis what we've been discussing, and for these technologies, what is the broad legal framework basis, your global experience, and if there's anything special happening in Singapore? Over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And I think actually before I talk about the legal structure, I just might pick up on some things that Jyothi and Vivan mentioned, because it sort of goes to the heart of some of the issues that regulators are grappling with. And the first is, if you think about traditional technology or software, you can usually always trace it back to the tech company that developed it. And it usually always has a very predictive sort of output. And behind the tech, you have the digital infrastructure, such as where it's hosted, how data moves through it, and the like. And that sort of is a very clear picture that regulators can then regulate. I think when you look at, say, Web3 and the ability of end users to rewrite and own content and then, say, distribute it via a metaverse, or you look at AI technology where end users are getting different outputs and the tech companies which created that AI can't tell you that is always going to be the same output. It makes it much more difficult to regulate, because in terms of who you're putting the bullseye on, is it the tech company who created the platform? Is it the user who's used the tools to generate certain outcomes? Is it sort of user-to-user interactions? Or is it even the tech itself, which is kind of an interesting conundrum. I think you might be familiar with the works of Isaac Asimov, who sort of postulated some rules for how sophisticated robots should be regulated in the future. And they sort of said, a robot should never do anything which harms a human, and a bunch of other axioms which would make robot technology safe. And in some ways, as AI evolves, you're almost thinking that you need something like that to make sure that the technology doesn't run away from the human creators who created it and what they had in mind when they did create it. We worked on quite an interesting matter for a medical devices company recently who were trying to integrate AI technology into their medical device, which would then be able to diagnose people with certain medical conditions and give them advice on what sort of medical treatment they should seek. And the question was, how do we regulate this medical device within the traditional framework of healthcare regulation? Because it's not a medical device per se, it's actually providing, it's not a medical device, it's actually providing advice. It's not a doctor. And so who is it that's responsible for the outcome of, say, negligent advice? Is it the software company? Is it the patient for using it? And it gave rise to a whole series of questions. And the conclusion was kind of not completely satisfactory, but the company decided that they needed to have a GP on standby, like a general practitioner, who would sort of rubber stamp the advice that the medical device was providing, so that if there was an issue, they could say, well, that GP is an actual person and they rubber stamped it, so they're the ones who are liable if there's an issue. And I think everyone felt a little bit uneasy with that being the outcome, like it seemed to not really be a very sophisticated way of dealing with a new technology. So, I mean, there definitely are some very interesting issues which are cropping up in the regulatory field. Maybe to just take a step back and look at the existing regulations. So, Singapore is probably like most countries in the world at the moment, which doesn't have a specific regime dealing with AI or the metaverse. It relies on a patchwork of different laws that are already there. So they have things like the Online Safety Act, they have Personal Data Protection Act, Cybersecurity Acts, acts which deal with fraud and online harassment, a whole host of consumer protection acts and the like. And so I guess the first question is always looking at the traditional sort of framework and seeing whether you're compliant with that. I think the next layer is then to look at sector-specific regulations. So we have healthcare-specific regulations, we have Payment Services Acts, which regulate how sort of cryptocurrency can flow through the network. And then we also have sort of Electronic Transaction Acts, which regulate how e-commerce providers can operate. So it is a complicated space to be in as a lawyer, because a client will come with a product or an idea and expect a simple answer, but usually there is a whole sort of thicket of different regulatory provisions that need to be worked through in order to give consistent advice. There are some sort of developments. So the Singapore government has released a framework on AI governance, which is it doesn't have the effect of law at the moment, but it is a standard that is passed to AI companies around developing transparency, maintaining certain security standards and the like, which AI companies are expected to comply with. And they're also releasing certain thought papers on how the metaverse might be relevant to industries such as education and healthcare, and how the metaverse would be regulated in those specific use cases. But at the moment, it's still a sort of wait and see approach. I think people are very nervous about stifling innovation at the moment, and they want to give the technology some time to evolve and develop before they take too heavy-handed an approach. And for now, we're just relying on the sort of existing patchwork of laws for regulating AI and the metaverse. Back to you.
And I'll just continue from where Harry, left on, that even in India, at a broad-based level, the way, this is done, and of course in the budget very recently, just last month, there were announcements in terms of enhancing capabilities of AI. There have been some sort of policy papers talking about the use of AI at a pan-India level. But I think the key is that even in our country, there are existing laws which are there, which are not specific to a metaverse or to an AI. You have the DPP bill, which hopefully should become law this year. You have the copyright acts. You have some other provisions. But I think just one short point from an Indian law perspective, a lot of these laws will need to evolve, because they have been written at a time where digital transformation did not exist. So for example, I'll just give one example and then we can move forward, is the Indian Penal Code, right? Which talks about assaults or harm and those sort of crimes. It essentially limits it to a natural person. It does not envisage, things happening in the digital world. So for example, if I am in a particular metaverse and I have my headsets on, and I put those nodes on where if there is some sort of virtual sensation, I can physically feel it as well. And if something goes wrong there, probably the laws currently may not be able to account for that. So short point is that with passage of time, the existing framework also would need to be reconsidered. But we'll take a pause on that. And back to the industry. Jyothi, again, you're so close to this particular vertical from an industry perspective. What are the use cases which you see in, say, Metaverse or the newer technologies, and how do you see this actually enhancing your business, your company's business? Your thoughts would be great on that.
So before I again talk about the use cases, again, it's important to distinguish these two technologies like what we are talking about. See, one is the AI, the generative AI, where there's no human intervention. The output is produced by the machines because the algorithms are trained to make their own inferences based on the data set that is fed into. This is different from the earlier methodologies of training AI where you had, labeled data sets like supervised learning, semi-supervised learning, unsupervised learning. So where you used to have training, label data sets and then make the AI learn from it, and then, make inferences based on the, whatever, on the inferences for the new set of data. But then we are talking about the generative AI. So generative AI, of course, is again what we talked about, like wherein the concern would be only where you don't know where to draw the line in terms of whether the inventor, like whoever is the maker, the author, this is, of course, he would have created data set, he would have created algorithms, he knows what output comes out of it and then gives it to you. But later on, AI learns by itself. So, do we stop rewarding him, because AI is doing its own job? Or do we also reward him because he is the one who started the game, but then it amounts to double rewarding? So anyway, this I would not want to go into it in detail, but this is the kind of challenge what the generative AI is, kind of posing. Of course, as already my co-panelist said, the metaverse rather, it's in kind of an intersection. It's not either an intersection, it's kind of a fusion of many technologies. It's just not one, it could be augmented reality, virtual reality, Web3, and others. And others would mean AI and your all other enabling platforms and technologies and things like that. So, well, if this is the kind of, the difference that we are looking at, then what are the use cases that my industry is looking at? As I already told you, that there are the brands that are coming up with digital stores, like Nike has come up with its digital stores, like they're using the Roblox platform, that's a metaverse, development platform. So they sell their products, that Gucci is using it. Ralph Lauren is, of course, designer, he is using Ralph Lauren. Incidentally, we are tied up with them for Indian market, so we have Ralph Lauren stores. Ralph Lauren has, its, digital stores. So this is where it's already happening. People are already buying their digital products. So you get into a digital avatar and then either you buy products for your own avatar or you can actually ship those goods back to your home. So Nike is already there. So these, and of course, the concerts are already happening and then brands are utilizing their services. As I told you very recently, Van Heusen on Feb 2nd itself, as I'm told, Van Heusen went into Metaverse and then we had like a concert for an hour. So people registered themselves and that was indeed a novel experiment. So other than that, of course, what's interesting that's coming up is buying the real estate space, like on the Sandbox and then, like many other platforms. If you're just to kind of look at the numbers, like, what kind of numbers are we, meaning the amount that you're looking at, as I myself was quite amazed when I read that about 100 meters, like if you look at a space of 100 meters, 100 into 150 meters, something like that, you occupy, imagine a space which would cost you about $2,500. And if it is again close to somebody, a celebrity space or something like that, like very recently the Snoop Dogg's mansion is there on Sandbox, and then next to his space, next to his site, the site was sold for about $45,000. So this is a kind of, the demand for spaces, retail spaces. And you can imagine this is for buying, and then we have to own these spaces and then run a store there. So it's going to be it's really a different world altogether, but it's happening. But then coming back to what are we doing about it? How much should we be concerned? What exactly? Where is it really getting, or how far we should regulate? All of these things. I think even before we get into that, I thought it's important to share some important statistics about these. just to talk about, the generative AI, there was this report by Gartner. So the Gartner says, by 2025, generative AI will be producing 10% of all data with 20% of all test data for consumer-facing use cases. So 2025 is not very far. So you can see that almost like 10% of all data. Now it is less than 1%. Now it is less than 1%, and it's going to be 10% very shortly. And it says that by 2027, 30% of manufacturers will use generative AI to enhance their product development effectiveness. So we are talking about the generative AI, all right? Now coming to the metaverse industry, so there is a company called Greenview. It is into research and development, a US-based company. So they say that, the market as of 2021, the metaverse market, USD $38.8, $38.8 billion, and it's going to touch a whopping 678 billion by 2030. We're not very far. So just over 6-7 years, it's going to kind of grow 17, 18 times in the metaverse market. But then again, if you again look at the very same report of Gartner, which of 2025 Gartner Emerging Technologies report, it says that it has kind of classified different technologies under various headings, like, very interesting headings. You'll also find it on net. So under smart world, you have like digital twins, metaverse, it comes there. So they say that these are the technologies which will take up from like anywhere from 6 to 8 years from early adoption to full adoption. So since you're talking about use cases, so though metaverse is there, though we are experimenting, but full-fledged adoption is going to take 6 to 8 years as per this research, all right? And then you have productivity revolution, which is like generative AI, self-supervised that my co-panelists talked about and all. Again, they are in the same 3 to like somewhere between 4 to 8 years kind of a window. Transparency and privacy, that is one area of technologies which is coming up, like which are all about your human-centered AI, responsible AI, where we talk about AI, there has to be human intervention, there has to be code of ethics for AI and stuff like that. So those kind of AIs are being also generated. And then you have like technology enablers, which are your blockchain, Web3, and 6G, and all of these things. Basically, these are all enabling metaverse and other technologies. So all of these, if you look at them, they are basically 5, 6, up to 8 years window. So they will take up to 6 to 8 years to completely bloom and become fully adopted by all industries. So these could be the cases we could be talking about, and then I think I'll reserve my future comments on legal implications and things like that to Huzefa, but this is the answer to your question.
Excellent. I think Jyoti has given the entire spread in terms of, what are the opportunities and what are the possibilities. There's only one bell which rings in my head, and I'll go to my left first, that what are the regulatory concerns? I'm sure even y'all are thinking that when are we going to discuss that? So, Vivan, first to you, and then, to Harry. What are the regulatory concerns?
No, so I think I touched on a few previously, but let me expand on that. I think some of the regulatory concerns will resolve themselves because of market forces. So for instance, there's a cluster of such regulatory concerns. For instance, you've heard a lot of talk about interoperability of late. You're led by the Europeans who are legislating mandatory interoperability into various digital laws. And India is following suit in a sense. There is this clamor for both ex-ante regulation, which you see in the form of the recently formed committee that is looking at a Digital Competition Act. You also, of course, have snippets of that in conversations around the Digital India Act, the forthcoming Digital India Act or bill. And I think interoperability is something where a lot of non-legal aspects spill over, and therefore it's not so easy to straitjacket it into a very narrow legal concept. So, for instance, I mean, take the example of voice applications like Siri. I mean, 5-7 years ago, or maybe even longer than that, these voice applications or voice assistants were supposed to revolutionize, the way we interact with our machines. And I think, I don't know if any of you really use a Siri type of application if you have an iPhone to any great effect. And I think part of the reason why that has happened is that Siri, for instance, I mean, why Siri is, pardon my French, a shitty service is because, Apple has kept it in a closed environment where the application is limited to some of the stuff that you do on your phone. And I think there'll be some self-learning on part of companies like Apple in the future to actually throw open such ecosystems and such services to a broader swath of consumer applications and to other businesses, so that there is a value accretion happens in a meaningful way, so that voice assistants can actually transcend just very simple operative things that you may tell your phone. And that goes to the corollary of that is that another serious concern that we've been thinking about in India in particular, and also in Europe, and we're doing a lot of stuff like Europe without really knowing why, is links to the question of data localization or cross-border data flows. It's linked to interoperability in a sense because, again, the kind of, and also to market forces, the kind of technology that is emerging today, it's very clear that you can't have a ChatGPT-3 or a ChatGPT-2 or any of these other large language models. They wouldn't have been possible if we lived in a world with a balkanized internet where you lived within walled gardens essentially. And this goes to the heart of the question of cross-border data flows, in my opinion. I think the minute countries start thinking of limiting the data sets that are available for innovation, and ChatGPT-3 trained on all sorts of things, all public web data up until 2021. So between 2008 and 2021, all that is indexed on something called Common Crawler, which you guys can check out. And it trained on that. It trained on Wikipedia. It trained on a bunch of libraries of books. And just imagine tomorrow if like the Chinese internet, the Indian internet prohibited our firms from learning on global data. At the same time where 85 to 90% of our IT industry revenues come from outside India and mostly from OECD countries. So we would, in effect, be shooting ourselves in the foot if we were not actually adhering to this interoperable environment philosophy in a broader sense, where it actually matters, versus thinking about which narrow services should become interoperable, whether it's such a critical question for society to be able to port data from WhatsApp to Telegram, versus looking at the larger innovation question that I just laid out. So I think we need to take a couple of steps back and take a 40,000 feet view actually on some of these things rather than getting too stuck into the details. You also want to think very seriously about the impact of constructs like licensing. And there's a big debate going on in India today, which again, I think all of you should participate in as young people. You're fortunate, I suppose, as am I, not to have lived through the license regulatory Raj pre the 1990s. After liberalization, we set up a few regulators, and a lot of our large industries are regulated entities. But what we've actually seen is that in sector after sector, as soon as you have sort of a licensing construct, there becomes this temptation to pick winners and losers within industry, to increase market barriers for incumbents, and all sorts of distortionary economic incentives creep in to the way that the state regulates technology. And I think if you see that panning out in the digital space, where every service that you consume is somehow subservient to some sort of a construct that a bureaucrat has thought of, sitting in a silo. It's actually quite antithetical to how you should think about the future of Indian innovation and Indian industry. And at the same time, there are these critical questions that we must grapple with of large-scale, population-scale impacts of technology that obviously need regulation and oversight, but perhaps not in the ways that we think are applicable just because the Europeans are doing it, like I said, with interoperability in very narrow confines and so on and so forth. And similarly, we'll need to think deeply about how policies, moving away from regulations for a minute, what kind of policies we have in place that incentivize the kind of technological supply chains that we need today. So for instance, in the case of ChatGPT or any of these generative AI, they're based on multiple things, which include something called neural networks. Neural networks are a concept that were first discovered by scientists and academics in the US in the 1950s as a mode of computation in a sense. And it's taken us 60, 70 years to actually put that into effect in a way that is palpable. I mean, you had a lot of practitioners and people from research talking about how these things would pan out even 20 years ago, but now you see it in effect at scale. The point is that we are the beneficiaries of this quote-unquote open science. We are the beneficiaries of open data that in fact exists as a corollary to an open internet. And we are therefore, I think it should be compelling enough for us to think of ways in which our policies can enable both without necessarily worrying about very narrow questions of services and applications and so on and so forth. And finally, I think to the points that Jyoti raised, I think intellectual property, trade secrets, all of these constructs will also obviously have to evolve, and technology will be part of the answer to their evolution. Just as you're saying, in the case of, for instance, management of music rights, it's much different from how we used to think about it in the past. Particularly, you have something, for instance, the Music Modernization Act of the US. There is a heavy technological component to how now you calculate royalties per stream and so on and so forth, which was not possible to do through those outmoded royalty collecting societies, et cetera, that still persist in the Indian context. So I think if we don't force ourselves to think harder about technology, we're going to come up with these sort of very legacy, old, tired responses to deal with the threats or risks from new technology. And it's going to be a vicious cycle that spirals downwards, and it'll be the exact opposite template of how we should be thinking about policies and regulations going forward. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Vivan. And just one quick point, right, on interoperability. Just, for the benefit of all, y'all would need to understand it in two different ways. One is at a device and hardware level, which is that if a particular plug of a particular phone is working in one phone vis-a-vis the other, that is one aspect, as Vivan said, Europe under Digital Markets, Digital Service Act is looking at. But the other one, which is slightly more nuanced, which Jyoti and Vivan both touched upon, is at a software level, at a data level, because there the ball game is completely different, right? There's no standardization there. Like then you're telling the world that, say, a Meta or Google or a Microsoft needs to build platforms. The backend has to be on the same architecture level. So these are very complex nuances which esteemed panelists are throwing inputs. But of course, as I said, back to the lawyer, Harry. In addition to what Vivan said from a regulatory front, what are the legal concerns and issues at least you see, basis your nexus to this industry?
Great, thanks a lot. And I sort of was pondering this question a bit before the panel discussion today, and I think there are sort of obvious legal concerns which people have touched on already, such as protection of personal data, protection of IP and IP enforcement, and the like. I actually didn't want to spend too much time talking about those issues because I think they have gotten quite a lot of airtime and people are probably more familiar with them. Maybe I'll just say an interesting one. I'm not sure if people saw in the news, but a couple of days ago, Hermes brought a successful suit against a second party who'd been selling Hermes Birkin bags in the metaverse. They had minted a whole bunch of NFTs using their own platform, and then linked those NFTs to digital Hermes bags, which you could then buy as an avatar and sort of stroll around in the metaverse with. And Hermes said, that's obviously trademark infringement. They were successful, and I think most IP lawyers would agree with the outcome there. But I mean, it is sort of an interesting example of how traditional IP laws are actually probably okay for various aspects of the metaverse and the use of AI. What I think is perhaps the bigger issue, and it sort of goes to some of the things that Vivan was talking about, but at one level, sort of opening up these new technologies has, the ability to provide massive advantages to people, from sort of, improving people's economic situations, increasing equality, giving people access to different sort of educational and healthcare services and the like. There is, however, a sort of flip side of it that countries will seek to exploit these technologies for their own national gain. And one of the things we're sort of seeing a lot of these days is the increased geopolitical risk that clients are dealing with. If you look at things like the US-China trade war, the conflict in the Ukraine, how kind of the pandemic has forced countries to look at their own national infrastructure a lot more than relying on sort of global supply chains. You do get the sense that countries are starting to look a lot more towards their own national interests rather than kind of a global framework. And this really does create a challenge to a technology which is essentially founded upon principles of decentralization and globalization and kind of community engagement. And when I say community engagement, I mean global community engagement. And the challenge will be that if you have a sort of digital world and digital technologies which aren't sort of limited by particular geographical and political borders, but they're regulated very differently across the world in different countries, how is that going to impact the commercialization of the technology or the rollout of the technology? And so one of the things that I'm quite interested in seeing is how it evolves on the sort of international front and how that then trickles down into the local law side of things. And then the other thing which I sort of touched upon before was identifying who is responsible for the technology. So is it the tech companies? Is it the businesses that use the tech? Is it the users within the metaverse or who use AI to provide other services to other people? And I think regulators will be challenged to actually work out who is sort of going to be responsible for the issues that crop up within the metaverse and trying to work out who to peg that on. So there are some high-level observations from me. I'll hand back now.
Believe me, Harry could have gone on for another hour on legal issues. But just one basic legal issue, because some of y'all will get interested. Today, if y'all would have used ChatGPT, you put in a prompt, say write an essay on friendship or a essay on Indian Contract Act, and there is an output. The simple question is who owns it, right? Because under most laws, the person who causes the work to be created is the author. So, but you have just given the prompt. The creation has happened by the machine. So does it mean that the machine owns it? Then the other question is then, is machine an artificial entity which can have rights? If it has rights, it has to have obligations. So these are some complex issues which are there. But very quickly over to Jyoti. While we understand the concerns, Jyoti, but what would be your suggestion to kind of ensure that we don't kill innovation? But what should be the overall broader structure from a regulation and go forward perspective?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the generative AI, so I feel the whole issue is about ownership. And then again, ChatGPT is not the good case to be discussing this. I'll tell you why. Because there is OpenAI, and they have fed data sets into it, and it also says that you ask this question to ChatGPT, it will tell you that I am not responsible for this. It is based on the database set fed to me, and then you please check the respective source of this data and then take a call. So it is not saying that I am the owner of that. So I don't think ChatGPT is the question that winning is the case. Good case to study this, but I would say that the bigger issue would be who owns, who should be given ownership. And as you all know, the Dabas case in UK, what happened, now it is pending before the Supreme Court. All over the world, you see the US courts, the monkey case, the Naruto versus Slater case, you saw that the monkey takes a picture, and then, the Copyright Office refused to give copyright registration. Of course, then there was this, the picture, the entry to paradise, the entrance to paradise, and the author comes and tells, the author is telling, is disclosing to the Copyright Office saying that this is done by the machine, and then the registrar says no. Sorry, if there's no human intervention, we don't accept it. So I think this is an issue not just in India, and of course in India also. Now that there is an application filed by Ankit for joint ownership, AI and all of that.
Interesting.
AI,
Because the machine, the Copyright Office registered it, then they cancelled it, and then jointly it has been filed.
is filed. But then again, the issue still remains in terms of even if it is joint ownership, my view is like, how do you even enforce the other part of it? Like, how will you pay royalty to that, or how will that person, or how will that AI do its bit and all of that? I guess this is something that we have to address it maybe by way of sui generis rights or something like that, or neighboring rights at what the EU countries have already done to some extent. So that's one thing that comes to AI. But then when it comes to Metaverse, as I already told, that Metaverse is like physical world becoming a virtual world. It's getting transposed into virtual world. So it's no different. So Huzefa just talked about the IPC issues and all of that. So I was reading about this case where a woman says that once her digital avatar, within 60 seconds, I think 60 seconds of she coming into the digital world, her digital avatar was gang raped. And she has made a complaint. So you can see that this kind of offense is happening. And then so I think it should be extended, whatever happens, what is happening in the physical world is happening in the virtual world but it is happening in a much amplified way. So that's why the laws should be applicable to, meaning the same law. I don't think you need to invent anything new. If you are doing wrong here, you are doing wrong there as well. So you'll be punishable there as well. But the thing again is, the law has to accommodate that. Your IPCs, all laws have to accommodate saying, boss, whatever you are doing for your digital avatar, it applies to, you, because you are the one who are doing it. But then again, there is a little catch over here. There are so many metaverses. It's just not one. As I told you, Sandbox is one, Roblox is another, There are so many, And then you are having digital avatars wherever. Like, is there interoperability between all these metaverses? Today, there is no. But eventually there will be one. But the whole proposal is to link this digital avatar to your social security identity or your Aadhaar identity or whatever it is. But if that is going to happen, then it is only you, that digital avatar, that is doing. So if you are going and signing an agreement with somebody, or I'm engaging services of Nishith, so it is me, because that's my digital avatar, and I can ascribe my identity to that. So I think these kind of little changes that need to be made as far as Metaverse is concerned. But as far as the ownership of AI, like wherein you don't know where exactly who generated it and stuff like that, that's a new issue, and that's a new question that something needs to be debated. And as I told you, something on the lines of sui generis or neighboring rights, something like that, we need to find some solutions to that. Yeah, thank you.
I think on the note whereby we need to find solutions to that, we will close this excellent stimulating panel. And I will say, technology will either disrupt or get disrupted. That is something which we've seen over the last decade. And I think on that note, over to the audience. If there's any Q&A, I can see a hand up. Please pass on the mic and introduce yourself. And we'll take one question and we'll close.
Yes. Well, I think you can hear me. I don't
Yeah, you're clear. Hello, yeah.
Hi, my name is Mansi Kedia. I'm the President of Global Most. Thank you very much for this invitation. I actually am about how AI used in the legal industry. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit about how the data is going to be curated to ensure that the outcomes that the AI puts out are something that are reliable. Because I don't think that in the legal industry, one of my big concerns actually as an academic, as a teacher, contracts is going to be quite a bit of rubbish, actually. And when people come out and they're going to rely on it, because we can't compete with AI when it comes to efficiency. And we're in a marketplace, lawyers want clients, judges have a huge backlog. So one of the biggest concerns actually that I have is within the legal space, and I don't know if there are other services or industries that have similar concerns. Within the legal space, what are your thoughts about data curation and mining the data? Thank you.
You want to take a crack and I can add?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question, and just as a word of warning, we have actually seen law firms that we've worked with using ChatGPT already for providing legal advice. The giveaway was that they forgot to delete the words generated by ChatGPT at the bottom of the email they sent us. So even within the last few months, like, it's definitely being used. Whether that's a firm position or not is another thing. To your main question, we've been using software and probably less sophisticated versions of AI to help us with various aspects of the job for a while now. And it can include things like doing discovery on documents, doing due diligence in the context of corporate transactions. We haven't used it for any more sort of cerebral work like providing legal advice or advising on legislation. I think there is a view that it's not there yet. One of the big challenges for us is whether we sort of develop something in-house and train it ourselves using data sets and sort of safety nets that we're comfortable with, which is a very big investment, or whether we wait to see whether a third party or a tech company develops something where they deliver it to the industry and it's standard and they've gone through that process themselves, but it's not something that I've seen in use. I think the one thing that I find interesting, and I'll promise I'll be quick, is with some of the technology that we see that analyses documents, it's getting sophisticated enough so it can give you an indication of how accurate it is. So it almost analyses its own performance. And so it will say things like, we've analysed these documents and we think our analysis is 86% correct. If you want us to rerun the analysis, we can get it up to 90%. And eventually it sort of comes up with numbers where it says, generally this is more accurate than a human would be, or this is a level that most clients would accept or most courts would accept. And so it might be that instead of asking technology to be perfect, you have technology which is able to give you an assessment of how good a job it's done and then take a view on whether, for the ease of use, it makes more sense to use technology or to use humans. But that's just a few ideas from what we're actually seeing. In terms of what the future holds, I'm not so sure right now.
Yep, and we'll close on that. Thank you so much. And a couple of comments, but we can take it offline. Thank you so much.